Hello and welcome, I'm Caroline Wyatt and we're looking at the Falklands myth and memory. What the Falklands War has come to mean for all of us 40 years on, for the UK, for the armed forces, for the veterans of that conflict, for the museums, and also what it now represents to us as a society. Here to discuss that I have three leading experts: Dr. Peter Johnston, who's Head of Collections and Research at the RAF Museum, Dr. Glyn Prysor, Research Director at the National Army Museum, where we're filming today, and George Malcomson, Curator of Archives at the National Museum of the Royal Navy. 40 years on, the Falklands conflict remains a defining moment for the UK, an astonishing chapter in its history. And I remember vividly the news when the war broke out, because the special assembly that was called at school told us of the Argentine invasion of the Falklands. And from then on, like most households across the UK, we watched the news every single day for the next 74 days of the war. And when the Argentinians seized the Falklands, it's then 1,500 people on the 2nd of April 1982, and the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, announced that a task force was being dispatched 8,000 miles to recapture them. Many at the time doubted the wisdom of that decision, and that included some of her closest advisors, as well as the US President Ronald Reagan, some British military commanders, some MPs, parts of the media, and the sceptics thought this not only an impossible mission, but for many an unnecessary one. Surely, some said, it would be better to concede defeat, to avoid the certainty of casualties, to abandon the islanders to their fate. Well, as Mrs. Thatcher later wrote in her Downing Street memoir, when you're at war, you can't allow the difficulties to dominate your thinking. You have to set out with an iron will to overcome them. And anyway, what was the alternative? That a common or garden dictator should rule over the Queen's subjects and prevail by fraud or violence, not while I was Prime Minister. And of course, we all know now how that ended with the Argentine surrender on June the 14th, after Britain's armed forces had battled against the odds, fighting also the bitter cold and the wind of the South Atlantic, and sailing home in triumph after they liberated the islands. And for Margaret Thatcher herself, it led to a surge in popularity, re-election in 1983. But at the time, that was far from certain. And morale back at home wobbled at times. 7 ships were lost to enemy action, 9 aircraft shot down, 255 British personnel and 3 Falkland Islanders lost their lives. And Argentina's losses were higher. The ripples from the war have been felt there too ever since. And over those intervening decades, many myths have gathered, and as recent documentaries suggest, our understanding of that conflict is constantly evolving in terms of what it means to us now. So let's start the discussion by looking at how the different services were represented in the war. Max Hastings, one of the embedded journalists in the conflict, wrote recently that it still seems a sort of miracle that the country proved capable of assembling a fleet at scant notice and taking it to war, narrowly achieving a victory on the far side of the world. And George, let's begin with you and the role that the Navy played in assembling that task force that set sail. How do you see that now?
I remember the ships had been taking part in exercises in the Mediterranean and were gathered in Gibraltar. And so a lot of the forces were conveniently in place, and these were later supplemented by ships deployed from the United Kingdom. And it was fortunate that we had the ships deployed at that time. And this was a huge undertaking for the Navy, which had been under pressure and was facing quite severe defence cuts. And so for the Navy, this was a pivotal moment.
And I mean, this was the first military action since the Second World War that utilised all elements of the armed forces. Peter, air power was critical to the conflict as well. How great were the challenges for the RAF, and to what degree did it have to radically adapt the approach that it took from the posture during the Cold War?
Well, I think that's the key point. It's that question of adaptability. You know, this is an unexpected enemy in a completely unexpected place. The RAF, like the Army, like the Royal Navy, has been looking east for decades, waiting for this moment of not so much if the Third Soviet Shock Army comes crashing through the plains of northern Germany, but when, and the balloon going up for the Cold War. And the force have been pared back and designed for that conflict. the dominant defensive thinking at the time was that any kind of operations, air power would be projected from the UK mainland into the combat theatre. So therefore the idea of launching from air bases overseas, covering these huge distances, was something that the Falklands really exposed as a flaw in British military thinking of the time. And it's something that's come to dominate. And you know, I think when we go through this anniversary period, we look back, actually, when people think about air power in the Falklands, they either tend to think of the Sea Harriers, which obviously were part of the Fleet Air Arm and the contribution to the Royal Navy, though there were several Royal Air Force pilots in there and in the helicopter fleet as well, including a later chief of the Air Force. But you know, beyond Black Buck and the enormous missions there, you know, the Harrier GR3s that go down as enforcement. You have the VC-10s that ferry supplies and casualties. Obviously, you've got the Victors. The Victors, I think, are the really unsung heroes of the RAS war in the Falklands, and I think that's a significant thing to remember as well. But that adaptability, that was the really key thing, I think, that challenged the RAF in this period. How could they repurpose, redesign, rethink how they were going to actually operate in such a different environment to anything they hadn't thought about before?
And for many of us, the battles that we remember seeing or reading about on the news at the time were the land battles. Glyn, I mean, this was incredibly tough terrain.
Absolutely. I think it's important to remember when we look back on the Falklands War, this is in many ways a horrific combat situation, not just because of the terrain, the conditions, the weather, but also the nature of the fighting. You know, it's the first time in a generation where British soldiers have fought close combat with the enemy, in some cases using their bayonets. And I think this is something that we'll perhaps reflect on a little bit more, the nature of the combat for soldiers, for the men of the parachute regiment particularly, but also the Scots Guards, the Welsh Guards, and many others who were part of this almost scratch force that was put together, fighting alongside Royal Marine Commandos, of course. We mustn't forget their contribution. But the fighting is of a very different nature to what the army is used to. After Korea, after the end of national service, what we're looking at is kind of post-colonial conflicts in small wars in faraway places. And as Peter has said, preparing for Russian aggression in Germany. And the other big thing that the army is doing, of course, is in Northern Ireland. This, in many ways, very tragic situation, the kind of internecine conflict in Northern Ireland. So this marks a big shift, almost back to a more traditional style of fighting, two nations putting their forces in place and fighting each other. And in many ways, it's the end of an era too. I think the Falklands place is in some ways as a bridge between the Second World War and more contemporary conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan. And many of the lessons that were drawn from the Falklands, particularly the idea of Britain being able to fight alone, in some ways for us, not so useful. So a very short campaign, but very brutal and very influential.
We will be coming back to the lessons of that campaign later on, but let's just look briefly at how the services are commemorating the war itself. And George, you served in the Royal Navy from 1972 to 1995. How does the Royal Navy now commemorate these events in a way that honours not just the victory, but also the tragedy of the losses in the Falklands, especially given that at least 130 of those who were killed in the Falklands, almost half the casualty were from the Royal Navy?
Well, the Royal Navy will mark specific anniversaries. We've had, obviously, major anniversaries and celebrations and commemorations for the 25th and the 30th, and now we're looking at this 40th anniversary. And there will be a series of events which will see veterans coming together. I think it's a chance for people to get together and discuss their experiences. And the museum does play a part of this with exhibitions, but it's primarily driven by the Royal Navy itself.
Well, Peter, we've seen commemorations already around the country with RAF veterans of the Falklands. How does the RAF remember those 7 weeks or so that changed history?
It's quite an interesting idea because for the RAF's contribution to the Falklands has actually been overlooked, but tends to have focused on particular aspects of it. So, for example, over this previous weekend, before we filmed this, it was the anniversary of the Black Buck operation, the first of the 7 that were planned and the 5 that were actually launched, and that has achieved a lot of attention. People looking at that, longest bombing raid in history up to that point. The incredibly complicated refueling plant that needs to go into it. Operating what was frankly a museum exhibit in a direct action. In fact, at the RAF Museum we have 2 Vulcans. One at our RAF Museum Midlands site was the reserve aircraft on the first Black Buck, but one in our Hendon site in North London was actually in cases, in crates, in the museum car park, waiting to be installed as a museum exhibit at the time of the campaign. And they actually the RAF came and took parts off it, including the refueling probe, so they could put them back into the actual service fleet. That has a sort of a level of romance. It's a very British thing, this sort of bodging and making do and adapting. But the wider campaign is certainly something I think we can focus on more, and we can look at. And I think our role as a museum is really interested in that. We can be a bit of a sort of a friendly disruptor in some of this narrative, and we can talk about the role the RAF played, because and we've made several key acquisitions to help us do that. So, for example, Bravo November, the very famous Chinook, we're really thrilled that she came into the museum at RAF Museum Midlands. We displayed alongside a GR3, again another veteran of the campaign. These are witnesses to history, and we've put them on display at the kick-off of the sort of commemorative period to both draw attention to the RAF's wider role and act as a springboard into those other things as well, be it the VC-10s or the Nimrod missions covering in the anti-submarine warfare role off Ascension Island, even the RAF Regiment going down and operating Rapier as well. They're often of everything that's overlooked, they're probably the ones who are the most. So it's important that we talk about them. And I think that's really where the services, the public and the museums can all connect and interact, and we present this. I think we're incredibly lucky in this country to have a public who are so eager to learn more about military history and their own military history, and so it's really great for us to be able to respond to that and provide some answers to the questions they might have.
Glyn, before you came to the National Army Museum, you were Chief Historian at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, so you've got a very real understanding of the importance of how we remember conflict. And when I visited the military graves on the Falkland Islands for the 30-year commemoration after the war, these were profoundly moving sights. How does the Army commemorate these events 40 years on?
I think there are layers of commemoration, and I think this is true for all 3 services. On the one hand, you've got families, you've got the next of kin. In some cases, that's still the parents of those who lost their lives. And there will be many acts of quiet reflection and remembrance. In the Army, you've got the regimental commemoration as well. And in many ways, that's more important than the overall institution, particularly for the Parachute Regiment, the Scots Guards, several other regiments that took part. Then you have the formal national commemorative moments as well. But I think the Falklands is particularly interesting in terms of the history of commemoration, because we had national repatriation. The families of those who'd been killed in the Falklands were given the opportunity to bring the bodies home. Not all of them did. Many, as you will have seen, chose to keep their loved ones buried in the Falklands, to give them often a more formal burial and more perhaps fitting than a quick battlefield memorial. But some families did choose to bring the bodies home. Some of them are buried at Aldershot, others are buried in family plots all around the country. So, this marks a shift away from the traditional approach, which was not to repatriate formally as a kind of a standard of commemoration. So as a historian of memorialisation and commemoration, it's a very interesting conflict. And I think that does shape the way that wider society remembers it. And I think in the Falklands you do see a shift towards more of an emotive, more of an intimate remembrance of military experience. And in some ways a more emotional response, less of the stiff upper lip and perhaps more of an acceptance of the horrors of war, the aftermath, the grief, the mental as well as physical trauma. So in many ways an interesting case study in changing natures and the changing rituals of commemoration. Now of course we're used to bodies coming home from Afghanistan or Iraq and being flown back, but the Falklands is the first time that happens on any kind of scale.
I think there's something in that, is that question of scale. When we look at the First World War, the Second World War, the numbers involved are so huge and so vast, it can be quite difficult to actually comprehend and appreciate these things. Whereas suddenly with a at this level of scale, and you're talking about a handful of casualties over particular actions, particular days. Now, these are devastating within their particular units, and they're often commemorated within their units. But the way in which that builds up means that people can have a bit more, I think, can have a more of a human connection with the stories, and they can understand these people as individuals rather than them simply being long lists of names. And that, I think, has shaped this, as well as part of really our as a society, the changing nature of our risk appetite for armed conflict. Even looking at something like the Falklands, the number of casualties in the Falklands versus Afghanistan. 13 years of combat operations in Afghanistan, 453 killed and thousands more wounded. But that was deemed to be too high a price to pay. And yet, you look at the intensity of the Falklands, particularly concentrated into a 74-day war conflict, but concentrated into a very short period of that, and then go even further back to something like Korea, the Second World War, the First World War, and you can see that as a society, our relationship with essentially with violence and armed conflict is changing, and we are, I think, as civilians have far greater pull on some of these things. And I know you talked about some of the lessons and some of the impacts that the Falklands had, and I definitely think that's one of them, that far greater connection between political decision and civilian and morale and choices and how campaigns are actually fought.
Well, let's look at some of the lessons learned for each of the services. I mean, George, what do you think was the biggest lesson learned by the Royal Navy?
Well, the Royal Navy were prepared for conflict within, as has already been mentioned, within the sort of umbrella coverage of the air defences of the United Kingdom. And I think the Royal Navy have always been adaptable, but that lesson of adaptability and looking towards being prepared for other conflicts. So they always say that we're always prepared to fight the last conflict that we had. So we came out of the Falklands with the idea that conflict could come from anywhere, not just a Cold War scenario with NATO and with that air coverage from the United Kingdom.
And for the RAF, what did they take away?
I think really it was the key about the importance of joint operations and how successful modern conflict how such an important part they have to play in any kind of successful waging of modern conflict. The idea that being these individual services, all right, fighting for the same aim, but essentially in individual components, wasn't really going to work. Should it have had it come to it? In some ways, it proved the success on the kit. So you do things something like that. The Harrier GR3, for example, had been designed to launch from airfields in West Germany or from hides in the woods or off the Autobahn and smash up Soviet columns. That's deployed to the South Atlantic. It's the pilots have to learn how to land on an aircraft carrier, which is all they have to be modified to operate in the salt environment. But essentially, they're conducting reconnaissance ground attack missions and proving to be quite successful. 42% of the ordnance dropped on the Argentines from the air comes from the RAF GR3s, which, bearing in mind there's only a small number and they get there later in the campaign than the Sea Harriers, is quite remarkable. It also showed the RAF's ability to operate at distance if it absolutely had to, although really pushing what was available. I mean, the Vulcan itself was actually retired shortly after the campaign. It was meant to be retired the following year of the campaign anyway. It has a very, very short space of life, but it doesn't convince anyone to keep that on for longer. But the lessons about needing to work with the partners, I think, are kept. And you can see that in particular in operations, Operation Granby in the Gulf War in 1990, but in particular in Iraq in 2003 again, and then Afghanistan afterwards too, I'd say.
And I mean, this was such a different campaign to the one that all the Cold War planning had been based on. It must have prompted a lot of debate as well in the army, in private as well as in public, because even now, programmes such as the recent Channel 4 documentary, there's been a very lively discussion about some of the lessons even now for land warfare.
I think in some ways the Falklands was a little bit of a rehabilitation for the army. The idea of professionalism, the idea of fighting spirit. Many commanders said that the challenge was not to spur on their men, but to rein them back from being too gung-ho. And given that this was a scratch force, it's not a kind of formal. It wasn't ready to go. This was put together at the last minute in many ways. I think the achievement is something that the army took away. You know, we sometimes forget what a difficult task this was. 8,000 miles from home, very little time to prepare. The complexities of it, just purely the number of ships involved, the number of aircraft, and of course the thousands of troops as well. I think there was a reassurance that actually this is something that the British Army could do, that this fitted into, and this is something that comes across very strongly, this fitted into a long tradition of operations and action and spirit that somehow matched what had happened 40 years previously, which of course was the Battle of El Alamein and those famous battles of the Second World War. So I think the Falklands also, for the Army, marks a generational shift. You know, we have to remember that many of those in Thatcher's cabinet themselves had served with distinction. Willie Whitelaw, Francis Pym, Carrington, who resigned, of course, as a result of the invasion, the Foreign Secretary. And many of those who are taking part are very young, 18 to 25 being roughly the average age. So this is a shift away from that wartime generation. And I think what it gives the army is its own kind of founding mythology for this new generation. This is a war that they can be proud of, a fight that was difficult despite all of the challenges that they were successful in. And I think it set up the army for the next few decades of challenges that came along.
And it's interesting what you say there, that the Cabinet's own experience of war. Do you think that may have made some of them really hesitate to commit men to the mission?
I think so, and I mean some of this comes out in the questions of how the campaign should be memorialised immediately after. The famous debates with the church senior church figures over the tone of the commemoration. Archbishop of Canterbury, Runcie particularly, is often quoted on this. His sermon in the memorial service afterwards was very balanced, talked about how war was always to be regretted, the loss of life, and he was a very distinguished tank commander in the Second World War. Kind of daring do, boy's own adventure type of thing. But he took a very kind of demure tone, as opposed to Thatcher, of course, who was all for a celebratory mood. And I think when you look at the responses of many of those more senior members, Willie Whitelaw, for example, I think it went down very well with him, that this tone was appropriate, as opposed to some of the media coverage, for example, at the time, much more triumphalist. And so I think you do see a slight, I wouldn't say disconnection, but you do see a variety of opinion within senior politicians, many of whom were far more hesitant, as we've said, that this was something that could be achieved. And of course it was someone with another connection to the Second World War, Henry Leach, the first Sea Lord, who was really instrumental in pushing for that decision to go in the first place.
But again, the true horrors of war really are only fully understood by the people that are taking part, and everything else, and the other commentators, the media, it can be a bit jarring.
I think from a geopolitical level, though, what people forget is the result often seems to triumph a lot of the understanding and thinking about what happened. At the time, there was a real fear, and it's mentioned in the special emergency debate in Parliament on the 3rd of April as well, that this will be another Suez for Britain, and that even if they launch a military action, it will be a humiliating defeat that will diminish them on the global stage. And that, in many ways, almost acts as a prohibitor without even going at all. There is a great uncertainty about whose side the United States will come down on, and the United States are called out in the debate. And then occasionally you have some more firebrand MPs who, reference Wellington, the lines of Torres Vedras, and these, about challenges and these sorts of things. And I think actually there is one of the myths about the conflict that we probably need to address, which is that because the way it's sometimes reported, because of the victory that comes, there is an assumption that somehow victory was inevitable and it was always going to be easy. And actually I think that belittles all of the participants. And I think it's really important that we maintain that. And this is not a foregone conclusion at all. It is a very extremely challenging campaign, exactly as you were saying, Glyn.
Is that narrative not shaped by the way the war was reported by the media, I think, which perpetuated some of those mindsets that this was somehow an easy...
I think so. I think that there are pockets of the media, I mean, most famously the Sun, for example, that have a very triumphalist, aggressive, nationalistic tone throughout, and there are left-wing papers that are pilloried for their urging caution and these sorts of things. But and actually the way it's reported, there's a really good comment, is this is almost one of those myths, because the war's not actually reported that well. We think of this is often referred to as one of Britain's first television war, but actually it takes weeks for this footage to come out. You specifically have a very dry, dull spokesperson put on the news just in case he has to report bad news, and so people wouldn't necessarily be drawn to it. And yet there is this huge appetite for information that the government starve the people of. The Galahad and Fitzroy, for example, it takes weeks for those pictures to come out, because it's all coming back through MOD-controlled communication channels. There is no satellite communications network that the journalists can operate independently. They're entirely dependent on the task force.
And that was controversial at the time as well.
It was controversial at the time, and yet at the same time the Americans also thought it was extremely impressive and essentially copied it in their relationship with the press in Granby.
Because Robert Fox, who was embedded there, I think he was there for the BBC at the time, termed it the last analogue war, because it really was the last war where you didn't have your own satellite equipment, you were relying on the MOD, on the armed forces to send your material back.
Worst reported war since the Crimea, in many ways.
Let's look at the home front now, the social impact of the war. And George, I mean, there were so many stories of enormous courage. Also, though, controversy about the war itself, and also about whether the truth about the war was being told at the time. I mean, what impact do you feel the war had back here on the UK itself?
Yes, as has already been mentioned, there was a huge appetite for news and information, and the way it was filtered through, and in some cases, people involved in the conflict took exception to the way some of the conflict was being reported, and felt that it undermined their operations, particularly in regards to the battle at Goose Green and the failure of Argentinian air-launched bombs, which were reported in the media. And so it was difficult. I think there was an appetite, but I don't think it was ever fully whetted, the public appetite for news and information. But then that's to be expected, I think, given the circumstances and how the information was being relayed back, and in a very controlled way.
I mean, we've discussed a bit about the embeds and this idea about truth and propaganda, but did it change the way that, I don't know, the UK felt about going to war?
I think it changed the way the UK felt about itself. And again, I think this is one of the things that sometimes gets forgotten in the wider discourse or overlooked, is that Britain is in decline in 1982. Its global role is shrinking. Much as Glyn said about what the army was set up to do, was about fighting a insurgency and basically trying to maintain the peace in a civil war in Northern Ireland, trying to conduct these counterinsurgency operations in the draw from empire, try and stare down the Soviets as part of an international coalition there, and as much as anything, also in the domestic troubles at home, the political turnover in governments, scandals, the general unrest that was coming. The Falklands suddenly gave an opportunity for a unifying factor, an opportunity for the country to feel good about itself again, and re-establishing itself on the world stage, having done it alone, or seemingly alone, in that very particular British way, where things are said to have been done alone, whilst neglecting all the contribution efforts from a whole host of other countries that went behind it. But what some of the triumphs that go into that to allowing that, the role of Anthony Parsons at the UN, for example, I don't think is ever necessarily talked about enough, about building an international consensus that allowed Britain to even operate in this way. Had he failed, had the UN turned against it, then there would have been no task force sent at all. There's no way Britain was going to go against the UN, given where it stood in the world. And yet this has allowed Britain to really transform and change itself. And then obviously the conflict played a role in the re-election of Margaret Thatcher, who'd been incredibly unpopular prior to the conflict, and yet calls a snap election afterwards, and in conjunction with a number of other factors, wins a rather devastating victory and re-establishes Thatcherism as a political doctrine.
But of course, this is a narrative that Thatcher herself was very keen to promote. I mean, the famous lines about this has ceased to be a nation in retreat in July at the Tory party conference afterwards. I mean, I'm always struck by the degree of political unity during these very early days. Michael Foot, the Labour leader at the time, famously, one of the founders of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, but also one of the authors of a very famous piece of work in 1940 called Guilty Men, under the pseudonym Cato, where, a staunch anti-appeaser. This was somebody who recognised that the Argentinian invasion was against anything that anyone could accept, and threw his weight squarely behind Thatcher. There were very few voices on the Labour benches who were opposed to this. And I think for us today, one of the challenges is to recreate and imagine the nature of society in the early 80s. We take it for granted that many of our visitors in the museum will understand that this is a world without the internet, without social media. I mean, I dread to think what would have happened had this been in the age of Twitter, and without those instant communications. And so I think for Thatcher, there was a real opportunity here that she had to grasp, to gain control of that narrative, to use this, as Peter has said, to swing that pendulum back from discussions about spending cuts and the Not Review, for example, spending cuts to the armed forces, unemployment, all of these factors, and to start creating a new version of herself. I mean, this is when she becomes this kind of almost mythical Iron Lady persona. Before, she was the kind of, I guess, a nursemaid or a nanny, giving the medicine to the country that it doesn't necessarily want to take. But after this, this is something that she really grasped. And I mean, I think we can overplay the ideas of decline in the 70s, but I think it's certainly there. And I think that people, because of Suez and because of this long generational shift that we talked about, are looking for a new moment, a kind of watershed moment. And we talked about the media presentation. And again, I think the kind of star journalists, some of whose work we have on the table in front of us, people like Max Hastings, Simon Jenkins, Robert Fox, we've mentioned, Brian Hanrahan, and the famous description of the aircraft going in and counting them all back. These are the moments that I think people remember. And so I think from that point of view, there is this shift in attitude and a more optimistic future, whether the ideas of Britain alone and being capable of, or whether this is something that is a realistic aspiration for Britain is a different matter. But certainly this is used to create that environment.
And certainly, I mean, it changed the course of politics here. It changed the perception of the UK on the world stage. What about the public perception of each force as a result of the war, George?
I think the Royal Navy's stock was always high in the public domain, but the way the task force was put together and how it operated and the loss of ships, this just increased the Navy's profile. I think they came out of the Falklands very much more widely known and appreciated. But funny that we seem to have very short memories and attention spans in this country, and it's good to have these memorial events and commemorative events to remind people of what the cost of these conflicts were.
I mean, do you think it wore off that real awareness that people had in 1982 of what the Navy could do?
I think it was difficult for the Navy, I think, because they had been under so much pressure prior to the conflict. I did wonder if this gave the senior naval officers at the time more encouragement to persuade their political masters that this was a good idea and that the Navy would be up to the task. As it was, but as we've discussed, it was a close-run thing on occasion.
And did it change the perception of the RAF?
I'm not sure it did a huge amount, purely because many people didn't see the RAF as having had a key role, and I don't think many people necessarily appreciated how important the role of the RAF has been. And that's not to say it's more important than that of the Royal Navy or the Army, of course, but I'd say it's perhaps more important than history has given it credit for. I would say that certainly when you look at the wider coverage and the wider sort of recognition given to those involved in the Falklands, you will see predominantly the Royal Navy, and then you'll see the Army. But even within the Army, there's tensions and conflict between whether it's all, in the words of one Scots Guardsman, bloody Marines and paras, and how he's sick to death of hearing of them. But it's, and there are other units as well that go down there that don't get in. And this is inevitable of any conflict. But I think what's therefore really important for us at the RAF Museum is at this time of increased recognition, it is us worth going back into this. This is why we exist as a museum. We are here not just to hold and document this history, but to also tell people about it. It's not so much that if you build it, they will come. We've actually got to go out and do that for them. So that's why events like this, that's why our wider Falklands programme is really key for us to present what the RAF actually did, so people can understand how amazing the victory refuelling operations were, how vital the Ascension Island and Wide Awake Airfield was as a launching base, how important it was to sweep the seas ahead of the Navy with anti-submarine warfare with Nimrod aircraft. All of these things are contributors to victory. That it's not about belittling anybody else at all. It's about making sure that at this time there's a place for the RAF, and to perhaps make people better understand the role the RAF did play.
And did perceptions change of the Army?
Yeah, I think when you look at the popular culture that emerged later on in the 80s, inspired by the Falklands campaign, I always come back to the 1988 BBC drama Tumbledown with Colin Firth as a Scots Guardsman who fights on Tumbledown. And the interesting dichotomy within that drama between the triumph militarily, the bravery that the character shows, his triumph at the moment of triumph at the top of Tumbledown, then is shot by an Argentinian sniper and is paralysed. And then you get the trauma, the aftermath of conflict, and the impact on his psychology, on his family, on his relationships. And that duality, I think, is really interesting in terms of the way that the public at large viewed the Army. That on the one hand, they're very proud of, as Thatcher put it, our boys, and what they achieved. But on the other hand, they're very cognizant of the damage that was done to these young men. This is a time when, although not entirely, PTSD and the trauma of war is more widely accepted. Again, a generational shift in terms of our understanding of post-traumatic stress, that this is a natural reaction to an abnormal situation rather than a sign of weakness in the individual. So I think you've got those two things going on, that there is a degree of rehabilitation, a pride, particularly in terms of the parachute regiment, which after Bloody Sunday had a very problematic public image. But on the other hand, an awareness of the fact that this campaign had long kind of long-running trauma and grief associated with it.
Did they try and prohibit the broadcast of Tumbledown originally?
Well, there were other dramas that came out after that had more problems. In many ways, it's surprising that Tumbledown went through so easily. The MOD had slightly different attitudes at different periods. But I think it's important to remember that this continues. The Crown recently, the episodes with Margaret Thatcher touched on the Falklands. This is England, famous film by Shane Meadows. The main character, I think this was about 2016, 12-year-old boy whose father was killed in the Falklands. And again, I think this, there is a long tail of the Falklands for such a short campaign. It has a profound impact.
But it's almost that other campaigns, I think, then take over a little bit. And I think one of the impacts of the Falklands is Britain's willingness to conduct essentially expeditionary warfare again. And I certainly think that what happened in the Falklands leads to a greater idea and a greater concept about the utility of force, and that leads to interventions in the Balkans in the 90s. It plays a major role in building that as an acceptable idea, Sierra Leone, etc. And those conflicts actually almost seem to supersede the Falklands in recent memory. And your comment about television is quite interesting, because actually then what you get is you get far more programs about the army or the forces in Bosnia, for example. Warriors, Soldier has an episode where they go on tour, don't they? They have a rotation down there too. And then obviously after that you then move into Iraq again, and then it's Afghanistan, and that's what we see now. So actually the Falklands has almost slipped out of, I think, when you come to make a war drama. You know, there aren't a huge number of British war films made anymore, but if they are, they're either going to be about the Second World War. I think if a sweep of what's come out in the cinema recently would be the Second World War, or more recent conflicts. And so the Falklands almost sort of falls behind that, despite the fact it clearly has all the history and drama that you need to make something that I think people would watch, and I think there would be an interest in it. It's just not really there, and that's quite curious. And if you compare that with Argentina, for example, in Argentina, this remains a dominant narrative in popular culture to a far, far greater extent than I think it is here.
And yet we do still get documentaries made, etc. And even at the time, we're talking about dramas there, but you had things like Simon's War, about the veteran Simon Weston, who became the face of the war afterwards and helped us perhaps understand the true cost of war.
The most interesting thing about Simon Weston, a Welsh guard, of course, but who was wounded on the ship. You know, again, this combination of the forces in terms of casualties as well as the fighting experience.
And each of your museums is putting on special exhibitions. I'm very curious to know what the challenges are for the three institutions when you're commemorating a conflict that was 40 years ago. It's quite an awkward period of time in order to say either something new or perhaps reframe some of the myths that have arisen. I mean, Peter, you say the RAF Museum has been using, well, one of the most famous helicopters in the world, so it's physical objects.
Absolutely, and when it comes to museums, people visit museums to look at the stuff. You know, it's a physical experience. That's what people want to come and see, and so we're very much driven by what we can display. And yet, particularly from the RAF Museum perspective, you know, our Vulcan is quite large, and similarly with these other aircraft as well. And they don't exist in huge amounts anymore. They've either been sold, they've been scrapped. Other museums might own them already. So when it comes to actually building these displays, it can be quite challenging working with the material culture itself. Yes, we can use medals, yes, we can use letters, we can use diaries, personal stories, photographs, and that absolutely has a place. But to put things in their wider, broader context, you want to look at some of this material as well, and it can be quite challenging to do that. It is very fun, but you know, we've got to go out and do it, and that's why we're so proud to have made the recent acquisitions we have, or brought things out of storage, particularly for this time, to really get people thinking about this. But also, as a museum, you know, there is a question of resources in this. This is a 74-day war. The RAF Museum commemorates the 104-year plus history of the Royal Air Force and its antecedents in the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service. 74 days is less than 1% of its history. So amount of physical space you dedicate to something, whether we're going to have this up, because again, we're talking about this in that commemorative period, but we talk about this history every day. We don't need an anniversary to talk about it, but it just helps drive greater interest and footfall in it. So these are all the things that I think from an RAF Museum perspective we have to do to really do justice to this important story, and that's why we're really thrilled to be able to do this now, and the acquisition of Bravo November has been so crucial for that, because that's going to allow us to tell this story for decades to come using this witness to history.
And here, coming in today, you can see physically some of those fascinating exhibits, the stories to tell, both sort of physically here but also online.
Yes, I think for the National Army Museum, we were looking for a slightly different way of telling this story. And, you know, very struck by, you know, again, a famous quote that emerged from Jeremy Moore saying, you know, the Argentinians fought for the islands, we fought for the islanders. And we wanted to do something to connect the experiences of those soldiers who fought on the Falkland Islands with today's Falkland Islands and the islanders and the community there and what it means to them. And actually I've been really moved by the Falkland Islanders I've met. We had an opening event for our temporary exhibition downstairs in our atrium. And there was a short film telling the stories of some of those who lived on the islands, many of whom had families that went back and had memories of the campaign. But the scene that really struck me was of children running onto a beach. And this was a beach which had only been cleared of the final mines, the final munitions, 2 years ago. You know, this is a conflict that has a very long tail in the Falklands, and it's taken many, many years to remove the last vestiges, physical vestiges of that conflict. And to see these children running onto that beach, I think for me was a very moving moment. And to hear Falkland Islanders talk about what this means to them, it demonstrates what a proud community this is. A community that really values the sacrifices made by those from all three services who fought for their sovereignty all 40 years ago. It's still very fresh there. Commemorating this war is very important to them. And so that's something we really wanted to bring out. That, you know, if our visitors don't know anything, they've never heard of Goose Green or Sir Galahad, these stories that we perhaps take for granted, you know, it brings home to them the meaning of the sacrifices that were made in a community that is today incredibly vibrant, far more prosperous than it was 40 years ago, and a conflict that, despite its horrors, had a really significant impact in bringing that community forwards and giving it a new spirit for the future.
And actually, I think that legacy piece is really important for all of our services, because the major impact from a military perspective of the conflict is the establishment of the Mount Pleasant Complex, a tri-service command. It's actually still the most modern airfield that the RAF operate from, even though it was opened in 1986. But it's a tri-service command. There's the Infantry Roermont Company, or the Roermont Infantry Company, the RIC, that goes down there every 6 months. The Navy will stop in ships. There's a huge RAF presence down there. Obviously, there's the air bridge operated out of Bryce Norton here as well. So that legacy of the campaign continues today. You know, we might be talking about events that happened back then and over there, but the legacy is actually really part of the fabric of British defence today. And, you know, Mount Pleasant Complex is the gateway and the guardian of the security of the South Atlantic region, let alone all that vibrant community you talked about that lives there. And so I think it's important that we say that this continues to be a live issue for us to talk about. Interestingly, in Argentina, the issue hasn't gone away either. You know, they still maintain this issue over sovereignty. There was an article in the Guardian on the 2nd of April from the Argentine Foreign Minister to this effect. So this is not done and dusted, and I think that's perhaps another one of these myths that we need to look at. Is, you know, what is going to happen next to the region?
And I mean, George, you served in the Falklands.
I have visited a number of times, and the legacy for the Royal Navy was that we had quite a significant commitment of ships and resources. In the mid-1980s, we had ships preparing to deploy, ships making the journey down to the South Atlantic, ships on station, and ships returning. There was a huge commitment there, which put pressure on our other commitments in NATO and in the North Atlantic and in the Mediterranean. So that continued for quite a long time before that could be gradually reduced. But even so, it's even today we're still garrisoning the island. So it's a significant legacy.
And this is a chance, I suppose, for the Royal Navy to remind people what happened then, how important it is to have that Royal Navy.
Yes, with current issues and our new forces, we're now in possession of 2 aircraft carriers with their air detachments. We could have been doing with those 40 years ago. But yes, it's an opportunity, and through the museums we will try and keep that in the public mindset. But the National Museum of the Royal Navy is a collection of different museums that cover each branch of the service. So we have the Submarine Museum and the Fleet Air Arm Museum and the former Royal Naval Museum, which covers the surface fleet.
And we are drawing to a close slowly, but before we end, I mean, so much has been written, has been broadcast over the past 4 decades by those who were there, by historians, by journalists who embedded, many others. I mean, Peter, what in your view is missing from the wider discourse on the Falklands?
So I've always believed that more history is good. You know, I'm a historian. The more history people are generating, the better. What I've particularly found remarkable and enjoyed reading about is the ways in which new platforms, things like social media, are being used to encourage people to share their own stories and contribute to this wider historical debate. There is the Falklands War Diary 82 Twitter account, for example, last year had an enormous uptake of followers and people engaging with it, telling stories for the first time. That, you know, these aren't in archives, they're basically housed in people's memories, and long may that continue. I think that's really important, and we continue to hear from ordinary people, whether they were in uniform or not, who remember that and took part. But I think one of the things that remains the sort of a substantial gap in our knowledge and our understanding is that Argentine perspective on this. I don't think it's something necessarily we talk about in the same level. People don't understand how significant an issue this was in Argentina and still is. You know, there are hundreds of schools in Argentina named after the Malvinas. The Las Malvinas son Argentinos is still a phrase that gets used all the time. There's an entire museum dedicated to the Malvinas in the South Atlantic in Argentina that features the conflict. And I think, you know, a greater understanding of that, I think, will help us in our understanding of this, because this is a live diplomatic issue that will eventually need to be resolved. You know, the conflict in '82 did not resolve it. From a British perspective, we assume that it is, and the referendum that followed as well, in which, you know, the islanders overwhelmingly voted to remain British, and it's self-determination, and it's right that we stand by that. That's not necessarily how the Argentines think it, and in an increasingly global world, we're going to have to engage with that somehow, I think. And I think understanding how the conflict is played out there is going to be part of that.
I'll just add that there has been contact between veterans, Argentine veterans and British veterans, but I just wonder if there was much appetite for that type of perspective in our media. There doesn't seem to be. I know that a lot of the naval veterans, there's been people have gone out to see the captain of the Belgrano, and they've had discussions, and but not widely reported. I don't think there was much of an appetite for publicising that reconciliation. So I take the point that the Argentine perspective is something that is not dealt with, but I know that books and articles published in Spanish from the Argentine perspective have never been translated and made available in this country, which is a great shame.
And Glyn, what would you like people to be thinking about as we look back 40 years on?
Well, I have to agree that we tend to see this in a very one-sided way. Unlike many other conflicts, we forget that there was an enemy there that in many ways shared many of the experiences of British forces personnel. Many of them were cold and hungry and ill-supplied and young, and their families suffered trauma and grief as well. I've mentioned the Falkland Islanders themselves. They're often written out of this narrative as if this is something that just happened to them, rather than them being participants in many ways, having suffered during the campaign. And I think, I mean, when I look at the kind of best historical writing, it's writing that avoids too much of a kind of gung-ho approach, that avoids the trap of making this a kind of cartoonish war. I'm thinking of books like Helen Parr's Our Boys, which really takes a holistic view from, you know, she is somebody who had a personal connection. Her uncle was killed on the very last day of the war. He was he was in the parachute regiment. And her book, you know, looks at this in its context. And I think that's very, very important, that we shouldn't see these campaigns as detached from many of the things that we've been talking about, the nature of society at that time. Having a clear-eyed view of the place of this campaign within the long history of the army from my perspective, but in terms of Britain's role in the world, and trying to do justice to those who served there. You know, the veterans are still with us, and I think this is very precious. You know, we've just about moved to a place now where the veterans of the Second World War are all but gone. And I think we have to seize this opportunity as historians, and during this commemorative process, to try to capture veterans' recollections in a way that will enable us to continue writing these histories in the future. So for me, I think that's very important, and it's a real opportunity over the next few weeks that we all have.
So I've recently been looking at some material that has been donated, which was gathered for a book, but was considered too graphic to be published. So I'm glad that that testimony has been saved and will give that perspective to this war.
And again, I think just to echo that, and I think we'd all probably say the same thing, is that if anyone out there does have memories, or that they do have material, or they have a family member or something like that, and they're looking for a long-term home for this for posterity that's going to help the nation understand that, this is what the service museums do. You know, this is what we're here to serve. And you know, we tell the story of our individual services, but we do so for the benefit of the entire country. So, you know, if anyone is looking for, well, from my perspective, an RAF material, then please do look me up and come find me, because I'm always interested to learn more about this and hear more about this, and see if we can't help, as I say, hold that for posterity in the future generations.
So if you have a Vulcan somewhere in your back garden, let you know. That is the perfect place to end. An enormous thank you to our three speakers today, George Malcomson, Peter Johnston, Glyn Prysor. And I hope you've enjoyed this discussion, and you can find out more about the Falklands 40 years on, all the topics we've been discussing at the National Museum of the Royal Navy, the National Army Museum and the Royal Air Force Museum, and of course on all of their websites. Thank you for watching.